what I want to do now is give you an example of how to dissect a press release. So we're going to have another look at that one that I talked about that illustrated the problems of communicating risk. And it was that one about diet sodas, as they're called in the States, leading to greater risk of heart attacks and strokes. Interesting. Anybody notice something interesting about that headline in the Daily Mail? Something that's quite telling. Correct. And that's the Daily Mail, not knowingly uncertain. So that shows that they have got their doubts about this. In a way that AFP, which the Independent, the wire services that the Independent lifted their coverage from, had no such problem with. So, in front of you, you've been given a press release that was issued by the American Stroke Association, and it was issued to all journalists via this thing called Eureka Alert, which is a sort of repository, a one-stop shop, dread phrase, for press releases that come out from all sorts of things, from journals to events like this. Now, what I want you to do is I want you to go through that press release, spend a few minutes, maybe 5 or so minutes, going through it and just putting rings round things that you think are important in terms of the level of compelling evidence for the headline that is being made. So, to give you a bit of a framework for this, I'm going to give you the classic questions that every journalist asks about any story that they get involved in. And I want you to apply this using your instincts to this particular press release. And they are who, where, why, how, and what. Those are the questions every journalist applies in some form or other to everything that passes through their brain. And I want you to think, well, what does it mean, who? Well, isn't it obvious? It's the name of the researcher. Yeah, I know who that is. I want you to interpret those in terms of deciding how compelling a case you would make, you think is made by this press release for what's being said. Okay, so I'm going to give you 5 minutes and then I'm going to be asking questions, as they say. Right. Give you a little while longer. As you can see, there are basically 2 separate stories in there. One's about diet soda, the other one's about sodium intake. Journalists weren't interested in the sodium intake because it's a boring story that we've all heard a zillion times before. But the soda story, diet soda story, was the thing they all picked up on. All right. So, now in terms of important elements of this study, let's start off with that first question of who. Right, so who wants to tell me something significant that relates to that question that affects whether you find this particular study compelling or not and worthy of putting quote marks around the claim in the headline? So, who? What are the who's in the press release? They're the society for a start, yeah? The institution that has put it out. Okay, they're not a bunch of jokers. That sounds quite good. And then there's the academic who's done the work and the institution that she comes from, okay? So, any questions that people might want to raise about that? Because don't forget, one of the key points about this course is not so much that you have the answers to these questions, but that you know the questions that need to be asked. Okay, so what would you like to know more about in terms of that who? Sorry?
Credentials.
Oh, sorry, credentials. Yeah, now what do you mean by that? Can you break it down a bit more specifically?
Is she competent enough to know exactly what she's talking about, or is she competent enough to run the right test that needs to be run?
Yeah, and how would you judge that?
If she's worked in that field, if she's a researcher.
Exactly. So what you can do is you can type that person's name into one of the search engines I'll be talking about later to find out if this person's got a track record. And if they have, what do their results tend to show? Because you will find that some scientists tend to be outliers who have a view on certain very controversial issues. And we need to know where this person fits into it. So it's not just the organisation, it's not just the institution, it's also their track record. Very good. Any other? You had one.
I was going to ask, I don't know what an epidemiologist is. Is that relevant?
Yeah, it is. It's very relevant because an epidemiologist, always worth using Google's dictionary facility for checking out these terms, because it means that she is a specialist in understanding the techniques needed to link health effects typically with potential causes. Okay, so she is a specialist in this area, so that's quite good. Okay, so both good questions. Any more who's?
In terms of the who's, I interpret it as well as who is this research about? As part of that, in the press release, it shows that of the people they studied, it was a good number, but they were all over 40, average age 69, so it's not indicative of the general population.
Yeah, very good. So that's another who. Who is this research about? Who is the sample being studied?
They're also all living in the same
place. They're all supervised.
Yeah. Yeah, so that raises big questions about generalisability, which is always a problem, even with the most scientifically rigorous study, even with the best type of study, which the randomised control trial, double blind, even that can have problems with generalisability, so that's very good. Okay, excellent. Where? So what where question would you raise about this?
I was going to point out the Manhattan one, obviously American one, like Manhattan foods and specific diet, and also compared it to say from India and
yeah, and also Manhattan, bit of a stressful place to live, etc. So we've got potential confounders. So the where, taking it very literally, raises questions about confounding and biases, all those issues. There's another slightly different take on where.
Well, I can't see where it was published if it was published.
Excellent. The first thing, and it was a complete coincidence that this one came up in this course. The RSS asked me to talk about this particular one. I've talked about this study before for mainstream academic statistical conferences. And the first thing that worries anybody about this actually is, yeah, okay, very interesting. Where's it been published? Because if it can't even pass the, as we've seen, not very high hurdle of getting into a referee journal, then we have to have concerns about it. Where was it published? Just as a point of interest.
And it was presented at the conference.
Which is to say,
it does come after presentation.
not always. Okay. Abstracts are one of the lowest forms of academic life in terms of strength of evidence, strength of study. They have to have got refereed. If the a question to ask would be, if you contacted this person, you could ask, what would be a good question to ask this person? So, well, I see it's just an abstract at a conference. What would you ask?
Has it been submitted?
Yeah, or better still, accepted. Yeah. So So that is another take on the where question. Where's this thing appeared? What journals it been published in? So it hasn't even passed peer review, and even that can be a bit of a joke. Well, you know, that's a real warning bell, and raises the question of asking the person the current status of the paper. I can say that it did actually appear. And here's a problem with, oh, it appeared as an abstract, therefore it'll appear in the referee journal. I can tell you now that what appeared in the referee journal was not exactly the same as appeared in the abstract. The conclusions have been changed, some of the statistical analysis have been tightened up, and it wasn't a particularly high-powered journal either. So, very good. Why? Okay, what why questions could raise concerns in your mind about taking this seriously?
Why is Zola apparent causing most of the events? That's not
They don't explain it.
So plausibility, exactly. There's no evidence for this in the prior literature. We'll talk about assessing plausibility shortly. So it's a bit of an out of the blue result. And these have a notorious track record of going nowhere. Back in 1995, a very good science journalist called Gary Torbes, who wrote an excellent book on nutritional research, which I can highly recommend. He wrote a paper in Science, because he was a reporter with Science magazine, which looked at a whole load of these sort of crazy epidemiological findings, where they'd found things like links between eating yogurt and ovarian cancer. And you're thinking, well, that's interesting, but why? And there was a whole stream of these. And I decided a few weeks ago, 20 years on, to say, well, whatever happened to those? And they either never got any follow-up at all, or were actively debunked. So they have a poor track record. So plausibility is something you need to ask. And these people, you know, saying we've no idea, but if they say that, when you put this question to them, you need to reflect that. We have no idea why this might be the case. Yeah?
She does say in her quote, if I was also confirmed, it would suggest it may not be. So I mean, she's pretty...
Yeah, she does caveat it, absolutely. She does do that. But is that enough? Yeah, because you can say that about anything, because we never prove anything in science. So the question is whether that caveat is enough, or is this another case of more research is needed? Yeah,
Which is clear that she's
almost
saying they must be confirmed with future studies.
Yeah.
I think she's very clear.
Yeah. But the headline, and if you look up the paper itself, it says that diet soda is associated with increased risk. It says is associated, not may be associated. It's one of these declarative titles to a paper. I think they're a dodgy practice. Yeah, in the actual academic paper.
I see. Because here it says may.
Yeah, and you could argue, well, when you say associated with, you know, you could say, well, that doesn't mean they've proved it, because causality is very difficult to prove. But these are all things that just try and push things a bit harder than they can really stand. So another question, a why question, is not only why is this link there, why was this research conducted? Okay, is it funded by maybe the sugar industry? Sugar industry want to kick the diet soda industry in the teeth somehow? Or because there's a lot of concern about sugar at the moment. Sugar is the new fat. Yeah? So that's another why. And the question there to ask yourself is, anywhere on this press release say who's funded this? Actually, there is, and it's okay. You might want to have a look at who that curiously named institution is. Just need to do a bit of rooting around on that. And on the published paper itself, in an academic journal, you must read the conflict of interest statement, because they can get in all sorts of trouble if they don't fess up to that. The how, what's a good, give me some good how questions that you might ask.
How was it done? So did they look at effects of sort of their other diet?
Yeah. How did they even know what they did? Right?
again, it's here where they say they didn't have the data. So they're kind of they're saying this is worthless.
Yeah, that's not what the press office of the ASA actually thought, is it? No, that's not. No, I know it says it there, but they still went ahead and published it anyway. There is a question to be asked about whether this should have ever got out of the academic community at all. Given those caveats, it's all right to put them in, but they have a habit of going missing when the story is actually reported. So this is one of the key problems with nutritional research.
Yeah, go on. Just one thing.
Sounds like you've got another one.
Yeah, just one thing I want to ask is why are they comparing it to people who don't drink any soda rather than who drink soda?
So there's a whole question about the nature of how the study was done, the comparators, blinding, the fundamental and randomization, of course, all these sort of issues, aren't in this type of study because it's the wrong type of study. It's not the top tier of research studies. It's sort of middle ranking, and it's in nutrition, which is a notorious field for the problem of how do we know what they did? Because people tell pork pies. We know this because you get them to fill in a diary saying, so how many chocolate cakes did you eat over the last week? Ooh, just the one. And then there are techniques involving the use of radioactive isotopes that allows you to actually measure things like calorific intake and energy expenditure, proper objective techniques. When you do that, you find people tell themselves lies all the time. This self-reporting issue is what leads to all these red wine's good, red wine's bad, red wine's okay, red wine's good again. Depends which week we're in. It's all dependent on these problems of the way the studies are conducted. So that's another big issue that needs to be addressed.
More hows as well.
Oh, right, okay.
Just in terms of when I was thinking about it, like how does this affect a person's overall risk? So it says that drinking diet soda can increase it by 61%, but if your overall risk to start with is only like 0.05%, 61% increase really doesn't affect it very much at all.
Yeah, so this is a standard problem, which is asking yourself, okay, so it's doubled the risk of this particular condition. Does that actually matter very much? In this particular case, it probably does, because these people probably under pretty high risk anyway. But in general, that is a very good question worth asking. If they found a link between something we all do, and some little known medical condition, well, you've got to ask yourself, okay, so they've doubled it. Probably still not much of an issue. 100 times nothing, still nothing. It is in general a question that needs to be asked, so I totally agree. In this particular case, the figure is worrying. The question is, to what extent? That's actually a what question as well. What did they find? It's a question that should be asked about any study, and I'm glad you asked it here. Any other hows?
The other one I had was about, they talk about drinking diet soda every day increase your risk, but how much is it? There's a reference to people consuming more than 4,000 milligrams per day of sodium. I know that's the other one. But just drank diet soda every day.
Yeah,
how much is it?
There's a whole problem with dose response and questions like that. Now, I'm not saying that you have to have the press release, with all the answers in there, but these are the questions that you need to ask yourself before you go ahead and say, yeah, okay, this is worth more people knowing about. So we've answered the principal what question, which is, what did they find, and whether it's plausible. Those are the key issues on that. So, any other points arising? So that was very good, very well done. It shows that, I know a lot of you don't have any science background, but your common sense is giving you, big pointers to the sensible questions that need asking. And just because they're scientists doesn't mean they shouldn't have those questions put to them. So,
do we need to ask how we know that they are the right ones to be testing the study? The group that we had for study, how do we know that they are the right people and people?
You can ask other scientists. We'll talk about that. You can ask other experts.
The The only other thing I was going to ask is that they say vascular events, which seems incredibly ambiguous. What does that mean?
Yes. One big problem with these sort of studies is that they can encourage what's called data trawling, where basically you just look at everything, every possible thing that's happened to these people. And if you do that often enough, you will find statistically significant links.
Does that just mean increased heart rate?
Exactly. It's all a bit vague. This is why, this problem of endpoints, clean endpoints, is really important. If it's death, then that's nice and clean. But when it's these vague things, we're running into a bit like the autism issue. We're running into problems of defining exactly the effect that you're interested in, that you're saying happens. All very important questions to raise and to bear in mind when you ask both the researcher and also other researchers. So to go through those questions, the who is, for example, the credibility. So that the key issues there are, the authors, have they got a track record in this? Do they know what they're doing? Are they some grad student who's presented their poster at a conference for the first time? The institution. Scientists like to give the idea, we just look at the study. We're not interested in it. That's nonsense. If you have exactly, and this has been put to the test, if you have people come from prestigious institutions rather than the University of Applied Burger flipping at Butte, Montana, then you will get a different response, okay? Because scientists are human. So some of the questions on where, again, that affects the credibility, are where has it appeared? How good is the journal, the impact factor, if it ever appeared at all? The impact factor is basically how, in some general sense, papers that appear in this journal convince others to follow it up. Why? So is this a bit of serious research, or does it have that sort of air of, does it have a popularist feel? Like, this has been picked up not because of the strength of the evidence, but because of the subject matter. I'm being asked to write this, aren't I? I just have a bad feeling about it. I think they've written the press release to give me a story rather than to tell me some compelling science. Is there a conflict of interest? There isn't here, but that can be another issue in the small print. The how affects the reliability, and that affects the type of study, which I'll go into a bit more detail about shortly, and also a concept called statistical power, which I'll also explain. Roughly speaking, the bigger the study, the more statistical power it has to detect an effect. But bear in mind that big studies don't necessarily produce compelling evidence for a very specific effect that they looked at. By the time they've sliced and diced the data, which they do in this study, 2,500, woo, big study, bit bigger than the 12 for autism. You look, when they've sliced and diced, to control for all those potential confounders, you're counting them up and you're thinking, crikey, look at all this lot. How many of the individuals are actually going to get through that particular maze? How many are you going to end up left with? You have questions about that. And finally, the what, so the size of the effect, to your point, p-values, which measures the significance, I'm going to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. And then that key thing of, but why? I don't get this. One of the least known but most important statistical facts that scientists need to be more aware of is that you can have a really impressive, by which I mean low, p-value, and yet it can still mean next to nothing if it has low plausibility, if it's inherently an unlikely hypothesis. I've given talks about techniques for factoring in plausibility into the assessment of statistical significance, and I'll be happy to talk to you about those after this presentation. So those are the questions.